Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm Lance Barron, president of the Sisters in Crime Atlanta chapter, and we are an organization promoting crime writers and crime readers. And as part of that, we have this program, Off the Shelf, usually on the fourth Saturday of every month, where Don Gepfer interviews an author about their book. And in addition to this reader program, we have Reader Rendezvous on the first Saturdays of the month, where crime readers, get together and talk about what they've been reading and why they like it. We are excited to have Mr. John Pruitt with us this morning. For those of you in the Atlanta area and even beyond, probably should know him as an award-winning news anchor on WSB Channel 2. John's career started back in 1964 as a television reporter / cameraman, and eventually was the top anchor in Atlanta, where he shed light on major news events such as the civil rights movement, Georgia politics, and other noteworthy public events for over 50 years. His reporting has been honored by multiple awards. He's in the Atlanta Press Club and Georgia Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame. While he's retired from being on the TV, he has not retired from telling stories. He has a debut novel out, Tell It True. It's a work of fiction based on the experiences and challenges he faced in journalism in his early years and during the turbulent civil rights movement of the 60s. Welcome, John, and Dawn, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am very excited to have John Pruitt as our guest author. He has written a fascinating book that, as Lance mentioned, is based on actual events. It is considered historical fiction. However, it is based on a crime that happened. And so thank you, John, for spending your Saturday morning with us so that we can get to know you a little bit better and learn about your book, and with the goal of having our reader audience get your book off the shelf and in their hands reading it. So
I'm delighted to be here and take part in this. Great.
Yes. Well, we're very excited to have you here, and I might go a little fangirl on you. I apologize for that in advance.
That's perfectly all right.
So I always like to start off these conversations with our authors, asking to get to know them a little bit more than the information that they provide for us on their book jackets. And there is a lot more to you than we had to consolidate your bio down to something that we could post on Facebook and Instagram. And there's so much in your backstory that I'm really curious about, and I would love for you to just tell us about your life.
Well, I was born in South Carolina, something I've never forgiven my parents for because I couldn't claim to be a native Georgian, only kidding. But grew up in Atlanta, the Atlanta area. Went to public schools in Atlanta. Went to Davidson College in North Carolina, majored in history. Came out of Davidson without a clue what I would do with a history degree, but I had done writing at Davidson. I had done short stories that were well received and even published in the college magazine. So I felt I could write, and maybe I could parlay that into a paying job. I didn't, you don't have recruiters lining up to sign history majors to big contracts. It just doesn't happen. So thinking I could write, I went out in search of newspaper work and was unsuccessful in getting a job. But one of the editors who interviewed me did take an interest and sent me over to WSB, which is another complete story in and of itself. And I really fell into that television journalism job that I love so much. Prior to that, I'm not sure how deep you want to go. I did serve in the U.S. military. Like many young men of the 60s, I expected I would be serving in one capacity or another. And given the option of being drafted or going in as an officer. I chose officer, and it was easy because Davidson offered, actually the 2 years of ROTC was required at Davidson, and I just stayed with the program and got my commission. Became an infantry second lieutenant. Went to Fort Benning for a couple of months for infantry officers training. This was 1965. We were on the cusp of the big buildup in Vietnam, and got orders to Korea, where I served for 13 months. Luckily, out of harm's way, tucked away in Korea, although a state of war technically still existed in Korea. There was no shooting to speak of. But as I was in Korea, I observed the buildup in Vietnam. And as an infantry second lieutenant, I probably would not be sitting here talking to you today had I gone to Vietnam. So that was fortunate. Out of the Army and back to WSB, where I'd only worked 8 months prior to going into the service. And they took me back in, and I guess the rest is history as far as the journalism is concerned. Did you want to know anything else? My parents, my dad was a traveling salesman, did not have a college degree. He was a Depression era man, and he traveled and sold pharmaceuticals. My mom was a first grade teacher. She was revered by her students, and she lived to be almost 104.
Wow.
And all of that time, she was an avid reader. I think that's probably where I picked up my love of literature and reading, because Mom, I couldn't find a book she hadn't read. And it was sad because as she aged, she lost her vision. Macular degeneration took her eyesight. And so I had to get books on tape for her and help her listen to the books. But she was a wonderful mom. My dad passed at 55, but Mom lived to be 104. So I hope I have her genes.
We all
Two
do.
brothers, two younger brothers, one of whom passed away from cancer, but my other brother also lives in Georgia, up in the Cleveland area. I don't know if I'm giving you enough biography or not. Maybe that's too much.
No, you're doing great. And it has sparked some questions. So I'm curious, you said you were born in South Carolina.
Mhm.
Is that where your parents were from? Your dad was a traveling salesman. Is that where your parents were from, South Carolina?
Yes, Dad was born in Anderson, South Carolina, and Mom was born in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And all of the Pruitt relatives, and the Nichols relatives, that's my mom's maiden name, are in South Carolina. And that's how I happened to be born in South Carolina. We went to Seneca, the city of my birth, and that's where Mom's aunt lived. She was very close to the aunt, and I was born in the Oconee County Hospital in Seneca.
Wow.
And then the family quickly moved to Georgia, and that's where I've remained ever since.
What brought your family to Georgia?
Well, Dad was a traveling salesman, and I think he changed jobs a couple of times and ended up with a pharmaceutical company that wanted him in Atlanta, traveling around in Georgia. He was gone most of the week, driving around and selling pharmaceuticals to various pharmacies and drugstores and doctors.
So now the next question I have. Oh, well, before I do this, I apologize to the audience. Please feel free to ask a question. You can raise your hand, or if you don't want to speak up, you can put it in the chat. We do have someone monitoring the chat, and they'll let us know or speak on your behalf. You're also welcome to speak up. I know from the audience that we have, there are people here who are very interested in John's story, not just his book, but his life story. So please feel free to interact with us and engage in the questioning. So now I want to talk about Davidson, because you grew up in Atlanta and yet you decided to go to a college in North Carolina. What was the draw to Davidson?
Well, I was a member of the Presbyterian Church, and believe it or not, in my high school years, I entertained the idea of becoming a minister. I was very active in Decatur Presbyterian Church. In fact, that's where Andrea and I were married. This, of course, came later. And I looked at Presbyterian schools, Presbyterian College in South Carolina, in Davidson in North Carolina, and Emory University, which was very close to home. We lived in that area. I could have walked to campus. So I didn't really plan to go to Emory. But Davidson was obviously the quality school that I was delighted to be accepted to. And it was quite fortunate that I went to Davidson. It was a great experience, a very difficult college experience. I worked like crazy, even though I'd done well in high school. I didn't know what real work was until I got to Davidson and had to compete against valedictorians from all over the country. And that was a good fortuitous event in my life. I majored in history. Probably should have majored in English. I did better in English and creative writing and literature courses. But history, I found, is a terrific major for a journalist because as a journalist, doing a television newscast, I was able to cover history by the day, plus the added advantage of doing it in the town in which I grew up. So for almost half a century, I'm covering history as it's occurring.
Mhm.
So it turned out just fine. I think the history major worked out well.
Yeah, and that was one of my questions, which you had already alluded to, which was what was the draw to study history specifically? Um,
That's a really good question. And I love the history courses I had and the professors who taught them. The English profs were also quite excellent. So it was a tough choice between the two. As I said, my grades were better in English, but I was fascinated by history. The courses I took, European history, ancient history, diplomatic history. I fell in love with history, and I'm still in love with history. Most of my reading is biography, historical, um, nonfiction books. So, yeah, I think the interest was always there. And when I had to make the choice, I went with the history major, even though my grades weren't quite as good as they were in English. And they were not stellar grades in either course, but I did okay. I got my diploma.
And so you come back to Atlanta and you land your job at the TV station, and then you go to war. Or not war. You
Not
join
war.
the military and you're on the cusp of a potential conflict, as you said.
Yes.
And not to get too involved in that because you already have shared that with us, but I am curious how that impacted you personally. You're young, you just started a job. You don't know if it's going to be a career, but it's something. And now you're off to serve and wondering like, okay, what happens next? I'm imagining. And if you're going to get to
Such
come home.
such a good question. Such a good question. Because I had gotten the job at WSB and was quickly taught to shoot news film, and I was reporting. I was going out. It was a civil rights movement. A great tide of history was happening right before my eyes, and I was so happy. And then I knew that my obligation was coming up. 8 months later, I'm reporting to Fort Benning as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Infantry and knowing I'll be gone for 2 years. And it was hard for me to acknowledge the fact that I was leaving a potentially blooming career, although I was hopeful, to do something that I wasn't that crazy about doing. But so many young men like me knew the obligation was there, and they answered the call. So, not to receive any credit for that, but I answered the call. I had no choice. And I agreed I would do this. I took the ROTC courses. I was a commissioned officer. So, entering the Army at Fort Benning, generally speaking, the Army was an extraordinarily important part of my life. Going in as, not reluctantly, but with all sorts of misgivings about what was going to be facing me. Not really being that aware of Vietnam. I mean, it was going on, but it was not something that was front of mind in 1965. As an infantry lieutenant, I was with 200 others at Fort Benning, got my orders to Korea. There were 20 of us in that class of 200 who got orders to Korea. Everybody else got orders stateside. Fort Riley, Fort Sill, the Presidio, wherever. We thought we were the 20 unluckiest guys in the world. And we went to Korea and we really were out of harm's way as the buildup actually began the week I graduated from infantry school. That's when we started bombing North Vietnam. And virtually every one of my classmates in that infantry class of 200, aside from those who went to Korea, served in Vietnam. And a lot of them died.
Yeah.
Following my tour in Korea, I came back to Fort Gordon, Georgia, greater Augusta area. And my job was to train young men to be soldiers. They were going to Vietnam. And so much had changed in that 2-year period. And so my job was to get them ready to face combat, to face the discipline of Army, to do all of the things required to be a good soldier. And I did my duty, but it was tough because these were young kids off the streets of New Jersey or wherever, farmlands in Nebraska. They were all, came from all walks of life. And I knew that they had to be toughened up because they were going to go to Vietnam. So yes, it had great impact on me and still does. And I look back on it as a time when I became a man. I mean, I understood some of the harsh realities of life and feel fortunate to have served for that time. And I think it strengthened me and it made me a lot tougher and gave me a perspective on life that I don't think I would have had otherwise. And I sometimes regret the fact don't have that obligation facing them.
So
And
I'm sorry, you cut out just a little bit, and you
Yeah.
were saying that sometimes you regret, and I'm really curious what
I regret
was.
the fact that there is no service obligation
Oh.
for the young people of today,
Mhm.
like there is in other countries where not necessarily a military obligation, but some sort of public service commitment.
Sure.
I just feel it's good for the country
Mhm.
to have people from all walks of life, no matter what their educational level or their economic level, to be thrown together in a form of service, whether it be military service or public service. I had never had an experience with an African American until I went into the Army. I mean, other than, passing experiences. And my roommate was an African American lieutenant, and we hit it off. And, it was just a tremendously educational time for me. And I think for him,
Mhm.
because one thing about the Army is, or any military service, it's a great leveler. Everybody's in the same boat.
Mhm.
And looking back, I think this country could benefit from an opportunity to have everybody in the same boat in some way. And that would be one way to do it,
Mhm.
a national service commitment.
I really like that idea a lot. And I agree with you that when we have a common goal, regardless of how we're put into that bucket, it definitely unites you with your fellow uh, your fellow team. So I think that's a wonderful idea. Maybe that's career number 3 or four for you.
I don't think I would ever be elected to public office with that as my part of my platform, but
I
we'll
don't
see.
know. I don't know. I like it. I really like it. I think it's a great idea. All right. So I think that's a really good segue into starting to talk about your story. And just so you know, I normally don't do that right away. I kind of spend a little bit more time talking about your career. But I think because you were talking about your first encounter and a new formed friendship with an African American, which was not something you had experienced before. And then talking about this real life situation that unfolded that sparked the book you eventually wrote. Can we talk about Lemanuel Penn and how you came about to learn his story?
Well, Lemuel Penn, for those who don't know the story, and many people don't, was an African-American retired lieutenant colonel who had served in the Pacific in World War II, was awarded the Bronze Star for his service in a combat zone. And he was a public school administrator in Washington, D.C. Wife, 3 kids. But he stayed in the Army Reserve, and every year he would come to Fort Benning for his 2 weeks of summer training, which all reservists had to do. In 1964, July 11th, he departed Fort Benning to drive back home to his wife in D.C. In the middle of the night, because in those days, African Americans, frankly, traveled a lot at night because they knew that there would be no hotels to put them up or restaurants open that would serve them, even though the Civil Rights Act of '64 had been signed the week prior. But Lemuel Penn is driving back to D.C. He has 2 friends in the car with him, also African American. And they drive through Athens. I-85 was not complete, so they were on the back roads, which you had to be on until 85 was completed, the next year, in fact. Driving through Athens, actually right at the arches, for those of you familiar with the campus, some Klansmen who had been night riding in Clark County saw the African-American driver, this is about 2 o'clock in the morning, and his 2 African-American passengers, and they saw the Washington, D.C. license tag. And they immediately leapt to the conclusion, these Klansmen did, that they were down here to help enforce the Civil Rights Act, the newly signed civil rights law. They followed the car, and at the Broad River Bridge between Madison and Elbert County, they shotgun Lemuel Penn to death. It was a sensational crime, a horrific crime. And to backtrack a little bit, when I wrote Tell It True, my novel, I knew it would be about civil rights because that was one of the formative things of my journalistic career, coming into the civil rights movement as a young reporter and covering it, the shocking violence, all of that I learned, the characters, the various points of view. But I needed a dramatic event to fictionalize to begin my story, and I did choose Lemuel Penn, but I fictionalized the event. It's not the same, but it's the same concept. An African-American leaving Fort Benning after his 2 weeks, a war hero, murdered. And I used that event and the trial, the investigation, the aftermath as a superstructure for the novel. But yes, I had been on the job, I think, a week and a half when Lemuel Penn was murdered. So it did have impact on me. I was not able to cover it because I had no seniority and no skills at that point to be able to cover a story of that consequence. But it certainly left an impact. And when I thought about writing this book with a civil rights motif, I thought fictionalizing that crime would not only launch my novel, but also might let other people know about the real crime. And in my acknowledgments, I do refer to a book by the late departed great reporter Bill Shipp called Murder at the Broad River Bridge, which does detail the actual story of Lemuel Penn, and I highly recommend that book.
For sure. I really appreciate you sharing that with us because I am going to be honest with you. I was unfamiliar with Mr. Penn at all until I read up on your book and realized that this is actually, based on something that really did happen here in Georgia. And also looking at the timeline of it, knowing that it happened in 1964, that's when you were first getting started in journalism, and then having to leave for a couple of years and come back. I was really, really curious how his particular situation, because there was a lot going on during that time, but that it was his particular situation that stuck with you. And they say,
what it says to me, and hopefully to everybody, is that even though there was a brand new civil rights law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it a crime, a federal crime, to deny service in restaurants, hotels to African Americans. You couldn't do it, any public accommodation. despite the fact that that law had been signed. The resistance to it among a substantial portion of the population, sometimes violent resistance, was very much a part of life and would be for a long time in the South, despite the federal law.
One thing that I'm thinking about right now is that Mr. Penn was in his 40s when this happened. He had been in the service, and as you said, he was a reservationist.
Reservist.
Just yeah, we know what I'm trying to say.
Yes, we do.
And that he had to go to Fort Benning as part of that obligation, which meant he was back and forth from Washington to Georgia multiple times prior to the act, and probably I hate to say it, it's probably the one time he felt the safest, even though he was still choosing to travel at night and be as protective and cautious as possible. He and his friends were probably like, next time we do this, we're not going to have to travel at night. It's going to be okay for us to come through here because times are changing. And then for this really horrific thing to happen.
I just don't think any Black person was under the illusion that just because a new federal law had been signed, that anything was going to change overnight. And they were correct. It was still a fearful experience for African Americans to drive through the South. There were so many forms of discrimination that they faced, some mild, but some violent, like Lemuel Penn suffered. Not being able to eat in a restaurant, not being able to stop with your family for the hotel room. You got to drive straight through. It was very difficult. And it would be wonderful to know what Lemuel Penn's attitude about that was. But I suspect he was fearful. As a character in my book, Jarvis Pendry, who is my fictional Lemuel Penn, was not fearful, but certainly cautious about what he did. And unfortunately, it did not work out too well for him in my novel. But it had huge impact.
Yes, for sure. And not to be forgotten. And so your story is helping to bring that up again so that we all re-educate ourselves on that situation and what came to pass.
Can I just add something real quickly? You mentioned re-education. I did a lot of speaking to school groups, middle school, high school, over the course of my career. And it was incredible to me how little they knew about life under segregation. It was as though they could not believe what African Americans had to endure, the indignities that they suffered, the racism that was so much a part of life in those days. And in a way, it's comforting to know that, the youth of today can't relate to that. That's something, totally alien to their concepts. But I think it's also important that they know and understand that times were pretty dark back then. And we've come a long way. We certainly haven't finished the journey, but we have made tremendous progress, which is something else I allude to in the book, the changing of attitudes. It takes a lot of time. It's generational in many respects, but we have come far since the 50s and 60s.
So getting to your story and the actual writing of this particular story, as we have said, you've had a long career in broadcast journalism. You have come in contact in 50 plus years. You've come in contact with a lot of information and stories and movements. And this was the one that you decided that was the story you needed to tell first, at least the first story you were going to tell. So please walk us through that, because from what I understand, you were still, when this story came to you and you said, this is what I feel I want to write, you were still working. You were still really busy. Life as a broadcaster was still happening for you?
Yes, I've been working on this for a long time, and always I have known that I was going to write a novel. It was just a matter of finding the discipline to do it and the time.
Mhm.
Uh, but when that thought came to me, and it never left me, I knew it would have to be about the civil rights era, because as I was approaching retirement a decade ago, the question I was asked most often was, "What was the biggest story you ever covered?" And I could never come up with an adequate answer, because there've been so many big ones. The Atlanta getting the Olympic Games, the funeral of Dr. King, which I was able to cover, the missing and murdered children's cases, the rise of Jimmy Carter. I mean, so many stories. Couldn't come up with one, but I could come up with one major theme story, and that would be civil rights, a mosaic of stories and people and events that, woven together, without question, constitute the biggest story I ever covered. So I knew it would be about civil rights. I wanted the novel to be entertaining and interesting and good to read and fun to read.
Mhm.
I also wanted to do some teaching. I wanted to make it instructive about this period of history. So yes, when I devised my plan rather to write the book, I knew it would be civil rights. Eventually, I settled on the Lemuel Penn connection as an event I could fictionalize to launch into my story, and then creating the characters. And the characters really tell the story. And the characters are always important, the real ones, who I covered, and the fictional ones, who more or less mirror the experiences I had with those real characters back in the day.
Mhm. Are you willing to share who some of the real characters are that you fictionalized in your story?
Well, understand that no character in the story, while they may resemble actual historical figures, is a dead ringer for that individual. But there's characters who have composite characteristics from various individuals I covered. A good example would be Devereaux Inman, the Atlanta business magnate who stays behind the scenes but pulls a lot of the puppeteer strings to try to get candidates who will hew to the line that he thinks is important to preserve peace in the city and to enhance the possibilities of economic development. And you could take a number of people in Atlanta's past, like Robert Woodruff, the legendary president and CEO of the Coca-Cola Company, who shunned any publicity. And yet he was so powerful because when he spoke as the CEO of an international company based in Atlanta, he had tremendous impact. And he did have tremendous impact in the moderation of the political figures running Atlanta in that day, like Ivan Allen Jr., the mayor. So Devereaux Inman, my character, has a little of Woodruff in him, but not a lot. Mills B. Lane, who was a more outspoken businessman, head of C&S Bank at the time. A little of him is in there, and some others I pulled in. So he's my own unique character with various traits from some of the real characters.
Mhm.
And there are others who everybody thinks they know who these people are. I have a candidate who's a candidate for governor, and he is an outspoken racist. His name Roscoe Pike. And people think they know who Roscoe Pike was. Well, Pike has the elements of some well-known racist characters of the past. J.B. Stoner, who was a Klansman who was really a hater and
Mhm.
let everybody know it. He had no humor. It was very vindictive campaign style. Used the N-word in his campaign commercials on the air.
Oh, wow.
The FCC said we could not censor those. It had to run. You can't censor political speech. He's part of Pike, but also, look at Lester Maddox, one of the figures of the past, a segregationist who had more of a sense of humor. And I put a little of that into Pike and some other figures from some colorful, some obnoxious, all of them interesting in terms of what created this point of view. Uh, all of them, or a little of all of them, are in Roscoe Pike, who's his own unique character. It was great fun to create these characters, and there are many more. And one of the fun aspects, I think, of reading the novel, particularly for those who have been in Georgia for a while and know something of Georgia history, is finding those little Easter eggs that will,
Mhm.
remind them of someone in the past, and they may or may not be right.
Well, one of your characters in the book, now the book is from the Gil Matthews and Mindy Williams perspective,
Yes.
and we will chat about them. But I found it really interesting when about your sheriff Lucas McSwain. And
Yes.
one of the things you said was, in writing fiction, you put characters in situations sometimes, and they will do things you don't expect them to do. So it sounds as if Sheriff McSwain did, like, who you thought you were going to write about changed on you. So can you tell us about that a little bit without
Well,
spoiling anything?
you've talked to so many authors, and I'm sure that you have heard others say the same thing, that when you create characters, give them a personality, their quirks, their demons, whatever, put them in interesting situations, they can take on a life of their own. And they can begin to write the story for you. They will do things that you might not have thought they would do. And it's a surreal thing, but most fiction writers will tell you this happens to them. And it certainly happened to me. And McSwain is an excellent example of that. Sheriff Lucas McSwain, who runs his county, the fictional Pickett County, is his own fiefdom. And he is calling the shots. And he is a bit of a racist. We may have dropped out here. Did we drop out there for a second? Okay, we're
Briefly, but I don't think
he's a racist?
much. Mhm.
Oh, okay, good. I'm sorry. I saw the screen
It's okay.
freeze. He is a racist, but he runs the county to suit him. And when he's introduced, he's a bit of a stereotype. I mean, let's face it. We all have a stereotype of the rural Georgia sheriff.
Mhm. Yeah.
And he fits that stereotype. Think Carol O'Connor in The Heat of the Night. But things happen to him, and he loses control of his world of Pickett County because the murder of my fictional character, Jarvis Pendry, happens in Pickett County. That's where Jarvis Pendry is shotgunned to death. It's a national story. So all of a sudden, Sheriff McSwain faces NBC, CBS, the New York Times, not to mention local media coming into his county. He faces civil rights leaders wanting to march in Pickett County. He's got the FBI and the GBI coming into Pickett County and really seizing control of the investigation because they don't think he's going to prosecute this crime because it was a black guy. And, we don't really pay too much attention, though. That was his point of view. So his world begins to change. And then the widow of Jarvis Pendry, Evelyn Pendry, comes in to try to seek justice for her murdered husband. And she has a profound effect on the sheriff over time. So he does change, and I don't want to spoil the plot.
Yeah, don't spoil it.
But he does begin to view the world in a different way because of his life experiences, which after all is how we all change attitudes, through life experiences, through having stereotypes exploded or dissolved, and we begin to see the world through different eyes. And so this happens to Sheriff McSwain, but I've already revealed too much of that plot arc.
Yeah, but I mean, I think,
he's my favorite character in the book,
and that's
without
interesting to me. Yeah, because I'm sure when you started mapping out the story, in your mind, he wasn't going to be your favorite character, right? Yeah, no, he was just a character, right?
He says, "This is what I'm going to be doing, John." Write some words to reflect that, please.
Yes.
And he did. So I should give part credit to Sheriff Lucas McSwain for taking over and help write his own story.
Well, I love it. And I can't, I intentionally try not to read the books in advance just because I might end up saying something that I
Sure.
shouldn't. But I have to tell you, I cannot wait. Like, I am probably as soon as we get off the call, I'm going to be like picking this up. It's right
I
here.
hope
It's
so. I
right
hope
here.
so.
Yes.
And I hope you won't be alone. Yeah, I actually have my own copy here too. It's never too far from me.
Yeah. So your main characters are the journalists themselves, cameraman and his partner, like his reporter partner. So tell us about Gil and Mindy.
Well, Gil Matthews is a young reporter cameraman, and back in the 60s, reporters were the cameramen and vice versa. The cameramen were the reporters. So they were going out as one-man bands to cover news. That's the way I did it. He is really my alter ego, I think, would be accurate. He has some of the similar observations of the world at the time that I would have had, growing up in a relatively cloistered suburban Atlanta neighborhood and suddenly viewing violence and racial discrimination and racism, as ugly as it is, as well as the courage of the civil rights protesters who were trying to bring about change nonviolently. All of that, suddenly you're in the middle of it, and it does have an impact on you and your worldview. So Gil is dealing with all this, and he is lucky to have a companion on many of these stories named Mindy Williams, who is a reporter with the Associated Press, wire service reporter. And very often they end up at the same location, and so they're friends and colleagues, and Mindy helps Gil on occasion and vice versa. So that provides a little potential dynamic of maybe something happening in the future. No
Yeah.
more plot spoilers, but the relationship is there. And
Mhm.
and Mindy is interesting too. As I was writing the book, I was getting some help from some writers who are friends of mine, and one of them suggested I needed more quirkiness in my characters. So I set about finding quirks. One of Mindy Williams' quirks is she loves poetry, and she has a way of just dropping lines of poetry as a period for every situation that occurs. It can be quite irritating to Gil and others, and they don't know where the poems come from. But most liberal arts college graduates will key on what the poems are. But I thought that was an interesting quirk, and I had a lot of fun with it. And English teachers who read the novel tell me they loved it, the fact that I'm dropping lines of quotations. I don't identify the quotes, but they're all Googleable, shall we say. And but she's an interesting character, and I probably the dominant female character aside from Evelyn Pendry, the widow, who I mentioned earlier. But Mindy has observations. She can be snarky. She's courageous. She represents to me the beginning of the wave of female news people coming into the business, particularly television, because there weren't any women to speak of in television news in those days, and certainly not in the field, and certainly not on the air. So she represents to me that first wave of brave, courageous, aggressive, smart females coming in to make their mark. And she does make a mark.
So when you were creating your character and you referenced that Gil is you at that time, was it difficult? Because as you already stated, our life experiences change our perspective. So was it difficult to go back in time to being a 22-year-old fresh journalist and recreate the mindset that you had at that time?
You know, I didn't find it difficult at all. I think because I had thought about it so often. I'm a reflective guy, and I like to think back, so it wasn't difficult. It was very natural for me to write the character as I would have remembered me being that character. Understand, it's not an exact match. I mean, Gil has some qualities that I didn't have, and I'm sure I have many that he didn't have. But yeah, that was not a problem. Some of the scenes from the book are very similar to what actually happened. There is a scene where segregationists are at a football stadium. They're rallying, protesting the Civil Rights Act that had just been signed into law. And violence breaks out when 4 young Black protesters come into the rally and they're beaten. And there's a scene in the book very similar to that. And that actually happened. I actually covered that. That was the first assignment I covered, which
Wow.
had dramatic impact on me. And I knew that was going to be in the book. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
So we're getting close, and I definitely want to open it up. I know there's other authors here joining us today,
Oh.
and one question a lot of them typically have is the process you had to go through from the time you finished your draft of the book to actual publication. What was that? How
From
did
the
that go
point
for you?
From the point I finished.
Mhm.
Well, my publisher is Mercer University Press. And I found it delightful to work with them. It was fairly easy. Once they read the manuscript, they had a few changes we discussed. Some of them I made, others I did not. Then the book went into the editing process, and the marvelous copy editor named Kelly Land with Mercer Press went through it page by page, and that was wonderful. I mean, she liked the book, and she cleaned it up for me, helped me a lot. You know, commas. We had many commas that were not there, or maybe some that shouldn't have been there. Anyway, she was marvelous in the copy editing process. And beyond that, the book was published. They did a beautiful job with it. And I hit the deck running on the book tour. That's been, 14 months in, and we're
Yeah.
still going strong. And I've loved the book tour, by the way, talking to folks and getting out and talking about the book. It's been truly wonderful.
John, I've got a question for you. Could you
Sure.
talk a little bit about some perspective on being a lone cameraman reporter in '64 versus what they have today in equipment and logistics?
Yeah. I did add some what I call process to the book to let people know what it used to be like in terms of the amount of equipment that a reporter, a cameraman had to carry. And if you were shooting sound on a story, you needed a big case with a camera in it, because you usually had a hand card if you were doing a sit-down interview, a light case, an audio case, a tripod, and you were doing all of that yourself, setting it all up, turning the camera on, running around to be in the lens, and hoping your subject was in the lens and in focus. If you were not doing the sit-down interview, if you were in the field, you still had to carry all this equipment, the sound camera on your shoulder, the amplifier around your neck, maybe a Fresolini and a battery camera and a light meter. We didn't know any better, but looking at the way it's done today, you can actually cover a story, write the story, put it out to the world on an iPhone. That's the difference in today. And you do it immediately. It goes worldwide immediately, as opposed to when I was doing it, when you had to shoot the film, drive it to the station, get the film processed, and then examine the film once it's out of the processor, then edit the film. It was a very time-consuming process, and nothing was immediate back in the 60s.
Thank you.
John,
Yes.
I was in television news in Memphis for a number of years, and I can remember splicing the film and, thing, because you had to do everything if no one was there.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading your book, as well as Murder at the Broad River Bridge.
Yeah.
And I just want you to know that right now I'm working on a novel that has an African-American point of view, one of them. And what that has done for me, as well as research, as well as books like yours, is that even though I'm not a youth and I remember the prejudice, I have never known it to this extent. And and I feel like I'm barely skimming the surface on all of it. But I do have a question. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
I have a question. Having lived in Memphis and all, and this is controversial, and this has nothing exactly to do with your book, but I'm just wondering if by chance you suspect that maybe Dr. King was killed because of his views on the Vietnam War.
Well, who knows? I suspect that probably played a part. That was a very controversial part of King's message when he did take opposition to the war, and that, developed a schism between Dr. King and LBJ and the White House. But possibly so. I suspect it was more racial. His civil rights activities, his activities in Memphis for the striking garbage workers. Yeah, I wish I knew, but probably played a part.
Yeah, I wonder that too. I'm in the Raleigh area, and there's a professor here at State. I think his book is called Origins of the Dream. And he privately believes that, but you have to be kind of careful what you say publicly. But anyway, it's an interesting aspect
Yeah,
to that, and to a lot of the racial events that happen, including the Wilmington massacre. And a reporter in the State has written about that, and it's horrifying. And I knew nothing about it. But because of that, we're beginning to change the names of some of our schools and roads that were connected to some of the racist politicians back then.
a lot of that going on around the country, particularly in the
Yeah.
South.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Finally. So we do have a question in the comments. We also a question in the chat. We also have a comment I want to get to, but Elizabeth's question reminded me of something. There is a reference where they said, where you said, or it was said that at the time of this controversial, civil rights movement, they didn't want Atlanta to become like Birmingham. Am I remembering that correctly?
Absolutely, yes.
And what did they mean? What was
Well,
it about Birmingham that they said, no?
all due respect to the city of Birmingham, but in 1963, Birmingham had nonviolent protesters in the streets, and the leadership of Birmingham decided to deal with that violently with high-powered fire hoses, washing those youthful protesters down the street with police dogs, ripping at their clothes, mass arrests. These are images that are probably in your mind right now. You remember them.
Mm-hmm.
They are images that are generational. They are going to haunt Birmingham for a long, long time. And I know Birmingham's a fine city, but those days, I'm sure that city would like to forget. Had they not happened, who knows? Birmingham might be like Atlanta today. But in 64, when my book takes place, everybody in a position of leadership, or most in a position of significant leadership in Atlanta and Georgia for that matter, Carl Sanders was governor, Ivan Allen was mayor. They knew that they had to avoid that at all cost because the stakes were high. Atlanta had to be the next big New South city. It had to be a progressive city that would invite industry, would invite development, would invite culture, major league sports. But all of that hinged on Atlanta handling civil rights protest the exact opposite way Birmingham did. So that's what I mean by that.
And that's really interesting. Yeah, and I'm grateful certainly for a leadership decision to recognize the atrociousness of that and say, hey, let's not mimic that situation. So thank you for clarifying that for me. So Sharon is an author, and she has a question regarding your book tour, and she wants to know if your publisher helps you to support it, or did you have to arrange everything yourself, and did you hire a publicist?
Good question. Sharon, I did hire a publicist. Mercer Press was helpful, but they make it pretty clear, and I think this is not unique to Mercer University Press. I think a lot of publishers make it clear that you got to get out and sell your book. I mean, you have to be very proactive in doing that, and I have been. I've made probably 70 appearances over the past 14 months, and I've enjoyed the process. But I did hire a publicist who helped me with that. Kathy Bennett of Magic Time Literary. She's based in Spartanburg. But she did a marvelous job of setting me up with really great stops, the Carter Center, the Atlanta History Center, all over Georgia and South Carolina. And I'd recommend that. It's very helpful to have people who know the bookstores, who know the players, who can line you up and set a schedule. So without that, I think it would have been much more difficult for me.
And Lisa has shared a really interesting story. And her in-laws moved to Atlanta in the early 50s. And the Grand Dragon of the Klan, James Venable, hung that moniker on his law practice shingle in Tucker. Lisa, it might be better for you to explain this. I'm stumbling through. Lisa, would you be comfortable telling us?
James Venable had his law office in Tucker, Georgia, and not only did his sign on his office say attorney at law, it said Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, and the Klan didn't like a lot of people. It wasn't just blacks; they hated just about everybody that wasn't just like them, and Italians were among that. So the story goes that's the reason my in-laws changed their name from Malizia to Malice. There's also other, ideas about what he might have been running from too. So,
well, Venable owned property at Stone Mountain, and would have Klan rallies there with
Right.
the Orange Cross and the whole deal. Later, that of course became a state park. But he was the Grand Dragon. He was infamous in those days, as were some other figures in the Klan. There was a fellow named Calvin Craig, who was a Grand Dragon in Atlanta. And he had a complete change of heart and change of mind after his eyes were opened by some African Americans. Zernona Clayton, for one, who met him and talked to him. And he absolutely gave up the Klan. He threw his Klan robes away, did it on TV. So there was some mind changing going on in those days, but I don't think Venable ever changed his mind.
No, probably not. Okay, so we are like down to the final minute. I'm amazed by that. And I guess my last question for you, John, is going to be, you do have all these other stories, historical content stories that happen before your eyes. Do you think you're going to write another book? Is there anything in the works or anything on the horizon?
Let's say I'm thinking about it. I do have another historical event that I think could launch the story. I think there's potential in the characters that I developed in Tell It True to perhaps have a continuation 5 or 6 years down the road. So I'm thinking about it. I'm visualizing the process. It was such an energizing process to write a novel, to actually hold it in your hand once it's printed and know that it's going to be on someone's bookshelf, hopefully for a long, long time. And maybe 50 years from now, someone will pick it up and read it. That's a wonderful feeling. Unlike television, where it's gone into the air, into the vapors and gone forever, a book lasts. So would I like to have this experience again? Yes. Do I have the wherewithal, the energy, the support to do it? Maybe. It's something that I'm entertaining and may launch into it shortly. Who knows?
Well,
but thanks for the encouragement.
I certainly hope so. I think Charlie wants to say something.
Did you happen to interact much with Hank Philippi, Ryan, when she was at WSB?
I'm sorry, Hank Philippi?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. We were colleagues at WSB, and we've made a couple of joint appearances. And she's actually coming back, I think, to the Georgia Writers Museum in Eatonton in a month or so. And I'll be reviewing her latest book. So yeah, Hank is, she's a dynamo, and she is cranking those novels out, and they're all good ones. So, and she based her early novels on her newsroom experiences. So she is, she's a delight and a very talented person.
She's a character.
Yeah.
Very much part of Sisters in Crime. So.
Oh, very good. Yeah. Well,
I saw your joint appearance with her at the Sandy Springs Library.
Right. Yeah, we had a great time together. It was like a reunion because I hadn't seen her in years. But actually, during the process of writing Tell It True, I wrote to Hank and said, "Give me some ideas." And she was very nice to do that. She loves to help writers, and
Mhm.
she's so active. I don't know where she gets all the energy, but she's a force of nature,
Yeah, she
and
is
I consider
amazing.
her a friend. Yes.
Yes. Well, that is so nice to hear. So before we go, if anybody has anything they'd like to ask or tell John, please feel free to speak up. We love it when you engage in these conversations. And if that,
Just ordered your book.
Oh, thank
Just
you.
ordered your book.
Oh, I should point out that I'm just finishing up an audio book. So for those who prefer to listen to their books instead of reading them, hopefully in a couple of weeks, we'll have an audio book ready for you.
who's gonna recite it for you?
Well, strangely enough, it would be me.
I'm glad to hear that. I was
Yours
hoping you were going
truly.
to say that.
And
Yeah.
I will tell you, it was hard work. It's you don't write a book thinking of the spoken word, so it's a challenge too. But I enjoyed it.
excited.
And hopefully, the final product will be pleasing to the listeners.
Yes.
Growing up in Atlanta and hearing you on the news, I've been listening to your voice and taking me back.
Yeah.
I'm glad you'll be reading your own book.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Thank you so
That's
much.
great. That's great. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us again this Saturday morning. I think it's a great way to get the weekend started. Mr. Pruitt, again, thank you so much for joining us. Was so thrilled when Kathy and I connected and she said she would get the two of us together so that you could join us today. It's been a treat.
I have loved it. Thank you so much. And never call me Mr. Pruitt. It's John.
Oh, okay, sorry. John, it is.
I'm
Okay.
old, but I'm not that old.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
Lance,
Thank
want to
you.
close us out?
Yeah, thanks again, John, and
Thank
we
Yeah.
really appreciate it. You've been listening to Off the Shelf with Don Gepfer interviewing John Pruitt, author of Tell It True. And just a reminder, on the first Saturday coming up, December 2nd, will be Reader Rendezvous, and that's open to the public. And you can go to our website, sistersincrimeatlanta.com, and get registered for that, get the link for it. And coming up in December, second Saturday is our regular chapter social event at the Decatur Public Library at the regular time. And then
And
coming-
don't forget with that, Lance and chapter members, it's our Christmas party or holiday party. And
party.
we're doing a, what do you call it, Sharon? Everyone's bringing a book. So John, your book might be represented there.
Hope so.
You know, where you wrap up the book and then someone opens a book and then someone else can grab it from them. I forget what
Perfect.
that's called.
Yeah, it's called White Elephant.
But
Yeah.
yes, I suspect your book will be there because I think I'll be buying one to bring.
Oh, outstanding.
And
Right.
before we get stolen.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let's all bring it.
We all know each other, so whoever steals it, I can lend it back to me at some
That's
point
right.
to read. So
Yes, thank you, Liz. Coming up in our January meeting, we have Deborah Goodrich Royce, the author of Reef Road, and you may remember her from All My Children and several movies after that. She'll be talking about Reef Road, and we're hoping we'll have a big turnout for that. And unless anyone has final comments, we're going to close this out.
The last thing I'll say is please check out the Sisters in Crime Atlanta website and check out our calendar. That's where you'll find all of our upcoming events and links to register and the details to participate.
Yes, all right.
Question, is this is being recorded so we can promote it?